Now, tonight we have with us a very special guest. He is an honored historian. His name is Dr. Michael Honey, and he wrote the book To the Promised Land, Martin Luther King and the Fight for Economic Justice. I just finished reading this book, and I must say it is very well worth your time and effort. It would make an excellent gift to any of your loved ones, be they friends or family or contacts. It's that kind of book. We're all for the better with the information available in that text. So Dr. Honey is also the author of an edited collection of writing by Dr. Martin Luther King titled All Labor Has Dignity. And he also wrote the very detailed account of the strike of the garbage workers in Memphis, titled Going Down Jericho Road, the Memphis Strike, Martin Luther King's Last Campaign. So we're very pleased to have Dr. Honey with us tonight. Again, his book, To the Promised Land, Martin Luther King and the Fight for Economic Justice, is well worth your time and the time of all of your friends, contacts, family members, well worth the read. So without any more delay, I will turn the mic over to Dr. Honey.
Well, thanks, Dee. I'm pleased to do this and to make contact with people around the country, and looking forward to the discussion. And I thought I'd start by trying to just kind of give an overview for about 25 minutes or half an hour maybe, and then that leaves another half of the time for discussion. I do hope you get a hold of the book. It's a W.W. Norton, which is a major publisher, so it shouldn't be hard to get, and it's not real expensive. It's 18 bucks. I think you can buy it online cheaper than that, and hopefully movement kind of bookstores will have it too. So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself before we get started. I know people are just coming online to hear right now, but before I ever was doing scholarship, I was an organizer in the South from 1970 to 76. And I'll show a couple of slides of that toward the end of this presentation. But I didn't start studying King and the Civil Rights Movement for some abstract interest. It really came out of my own experience going down south in 1970 as a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War, working with the Southern Conference Educational Fund with Carl and Ann Braden in Louisville, Fred Shuttlesworth, many other great figures from the 60s were involved with Southern Conference. And a lot of our fight back then was about trying to push back this wave of repression under the Nixon administration. And of course, one of the major campaigns that I worked on was the Free Angela Davis and all political prisoners. And so I know a lot of people around the country from working on that campaign. But there were political prisoner campaigns going on all over the South. It was really, truly a time that sort of harked to what Dr. King said right after he was killed in an article he wrote for Look magazine, where he said, "I fear the country could become a fascist country through racism, through racial division." And it's kind of, it's still worrisome that this is the way fascism could come to the US. So what I'm going to do, hopefully you can see the slides here. The reason the book is written is that we want to go beyond what most people think they know about Dr. King Each generation rewrites history and rethinks history. And during the period we're in right now, my publisher, W.W. Norton, wanted a book that would confront the economic injustice of our own time by going back to the legacy of Dr. King. And our idea, of course, with this is that if you really understand King, there's a legacy there of labor and civil rights and economic justice and anti-war that probably most of you know about who are on this webinar. But I'm going to try to put it in a little more context. It's important also in the time that we're in. I don't probably have to say very much about this, but we're in a period of right-wing control of government, and things getting worse every day. But the Trump phenomenon is more of a symptom than a cause. The Republican Party has been pushing these things that he's doing for years and years, and certainly during Martin Luther King's day, fighting Richard Nixon and other right-wing Republicans at that time. So huge tax cuts for the rich, and cutting back food stamps and warfare policies and all these things that we see Trump doing now and the Republican Party. It's just a symptom of the very things that Dr. King was talking about when he died. King preached, and we still find it today, that those who have the greatest wealth and power can never get enough, and they always want more, and they don't seem to care if they get it at the expense of everybody else. Other capitalist countries are not as brutal in the way the US is. I spent a term in Norway last year studying their labor and economic system, and they're a capitalist country, but they're also what we call social democratic. People have a lot of the things that Bernie Sanders is calling for: college tuition paid for, union rights assured. 50% of people belong to unions, but almost all public employees belong to unions. Prepaid childcare, and people taking full leave when they have children, both the man and the woman, if that's the partners, and a lot of the certainly universal health care, the things that Bernie Sanders is campaigning for, and Elizabeth Warren also. These are things that people have in other countries that are capitalist countries. So it doesn't even have to be what we would think of as socialism, which is ownership of the means of production, rather controlling capitalism through economic and social justice and politics. So that's really what King was trying to do. King was what you'd call small s, small d, social democrat, and learned about all of these things very early in his life, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. This quote that you're looking at right now, the framework here is to look beyond the iconic view of King as a racial harmony advocate, civil rights leader, and to get beyond that to the larger issues, or the deeper issues, maybe you'd say. Racial harmony and civil rights, of course, were central to his ideas, but the larger framework is dealing with all forms of oppression and economic injustice. And the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65, he called this phase one of the movement, and not the stopping point, but the beginning point. And from there, he wanted to go beyond that to economic justice for all people and ending the warfare state. So he called for a moral revolution to replace self-seeking individualism of the rich with an overriding concern for the common good. So the book, To the Promised Land, asked us to think about, well, what would it mean to actually fulfill King's legacy in our own time? Let's see, this should go to the next slide. There we go. One of the great authors of movement history is Robin Kelly, who wrote a book about Black workers and the Communist Party in Alabama in the 1930s, which if you haven't read that, I would really urge you to read Hammer and Hoe, his path-breaking work. And he and I started our work on the CIO and the movement and Communist Party and leftist organizing within the labor movement and the civil rights movement in the South right around the same time. So we've known each other for a long time. And he calls this a dangerous book. What he really means by that is that if people took King's economic justice platform seriously, King would have a dangerous legacy, which he does. And more people are turning to that and understanding it much better. So let's go back to sort of King's roots. It starts with the question of slavery, and most of the writing about King has not really emphasized this, but I've emphasized it a lot in this book and in my other writings, that King was a product of the era of not only segregation, but before that, slavery. The March on Washington in 1963 was to commemorate 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, when his great-grandfather was a slave. And so, you know, King's framework of economic justice isn't something that just came to him later. A lot of early writing about King sort of said, oh, he was a civil rights advocate and he got more radical as he went, and then started pushing for economic justice in the Poor People's Campaign, and of course the Memphis sanitation strike. But actually it's rooted in his views all along. And as it says here, King was drawing on the knowledge of slave ancestors and sharecroppers. His father had been a sharecropper. He was only 2 generations, Martin was only 2 generations removed from slavery. So when we think of him, you know, speaking about the American dream in a suit and a tie, we have to also remember that along with the American dream, he was quite aware of the American nightmare. And he grew up in this in the 1930s in Atlanta, in the midst of the Great Depression. If you go to the King home today, which is now National Park Service place, where you can really study the history, you can see that it's not a well-to-do neighborhood, and in the 30s it was really not a well-to-do neighborhood. He grew up in a pretty nice house because his father was one of the most sought-after preachers in Atlanta. So he was relatively privileged, but poor people were all around him. So when he went to Montgomery in his first job as a minister, he was drawing on, first of all, his great learning as a PhD and also a theologian. And so, he started with that framework of preaching righteousness and justice, which was what his father, Martin Luther King Sr., also preached. But he added to that what his father did not have, which was the theory and practice of nonviolence. And so he had already imbibed a lot of the ideas from Gandhi and from Thoreau and our movement history. But the Montgomery bus boycott sort of brought it all into focus when suddenly he had to actually put his sort of grand ideas into practice. And the only way to do that was through a mass movement, because that was the only power really that anybody had to combat segregation. African Americans, as I'm sure you're well aware, in Alabama couldn't vote. A few people were able to manage it, but the laws were all set up to prevent you from voting. And so when they wanted to protest the segregation on the buses, really the only answer to that was direct action. And nonviolence is withdrawing your support from an oppressive system. And so that's what they did. People just stopped riding the bus. And it went on for well over a year. King's very first speech on December 5th, 1955, was interesting that even then he was putting this in a class framework. He said, we are the disinherited of this land. And he also said, when labor all over this nation came to see that it would be trampled over by capitalistic power, there was nothing wrong with labor protesting for its rights. So King already had this idea, and he and Coretta Scott had done a lot of correspondence with each other when they were courting, and they both talked about socialism and that there should be a better system than capitalism. King even said in his economic views, he was more or less a Marxist, but of course, in his spiritual views, he was a Christian, he was a Baptist. So he combined these things in a very interesting way. And at the core of it was the working class people themselves who were able, to carry this campaign forward. It was the domestic workers who rode the buses and janitors and people at the Air Force Base. Most of the people on the buses were African Americans who couldn't afford a car. And so really they were the ones that carried the campaign forward. And King said, this movement was not about me. It would have happened if I was there or not. And so he always saw it in this context of building a movement among poor people and a coalition. One of the things maybe people should think about when they think about King is the power of mass coalition. And this is what he was really good at doing, was crossing the lines between poor and working class people and well-educated middle and upper class people, Black and white, Latino, Native American. This is ultimately what he put together in the Poor People's Campaign. And his strategy always was building a mass coalition, and this is how you bring about change. Of course, he was attacked right from the beginning. People blew up his house. Coretta King and their first child was in the front room, and she heard some noise, and she moved to the back room, and the front room was obliterated by a bomb. King was picked up a number of times and taken out on country roads. He thought they were going to kill him. So he was arrested probably 30 times in his life. And so this was always hanging over his head. But when they won their case, finally at the Supreme Court, and abolished bus segregation on interstate commerce, it was a time when he got a lot of attention. And then he began traveling and speaking all over the country and eventually all over the world about the goals and the aspirations of the Black freedom movement. So he became an extraordinarily important leader. As he said, without him, the movement would have gone on anyway, and we wouldn't know much about him if it hadn't been for these mass movements. On the other hand, he had some skills of oratory and being able to put things in a large context that proved to be crucial. So this is King in 1957 at Highlander Center in Tennessee. And there you see King on the left, Pete Seeger in the middle, Rosa Parks and Ralph Abernathy, and in the middle is Sharice Horton, Miles Horton's daughter. This was a time when they were organizing movements and starting to figure out what were the next steps. And here's what came of it. Someone in the audience was from the Georgia so-called Education Commission. Took a picture of King in the front row there, and this picture, Martin Luther King at a communist training school, was then spread all over the South. This is on a billboard that people passed on the way from the struggle from Selma to Montgomery. So it was on billboards around the South. I have a postcard sent from the John Birch Society with this same thing on it. So what the effort was immediately, of course, was to try to isolate King, but it was part of the whole anti-communist fervor against both civil rights and labor, which had been, going on heavily since World War II and at various times during our history. Before that, it's the same thing that the CIO unions faced in the South. And of course, I'm sure most of you know this, that, all you had to do was be a civil rights activist and you were automatically a communist, according to the right wing. So we're getting a recrudescence of this with Trump, who was schooled in this by Roy Cohn, who was an attorney who was the right-hand man of Joseph McCarthy. So King always had to struggle against anti-communism. But in his speeches that I collected to labor organizations, he always talked about the connection between race and class. At this Highlander meeting, he said, "I never intend to adjust myself to the evils of segregation and the tragic inequalities of an economic system which takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes." The Christian Anti-Communist Crusade and other groups attacked him all the time. And of course, then the FBI picked up the campaign against King. So they thought King was a revolutionary. And it's kind of absurd when you think about that. They thought maybe he was a communist, and he was the most famous Baptist preacher of his time next to Billy Graham. But he was a revolutionary in that he was a follower of nonviolence. And James Lawson, who worked closely with King, said a follower of nonviolence is against violence in all its forms. And that's economic, it's racial, it's war, it's capitalism. All these forms of violence are all part of what we're trying to change, the cruelty systems that keep people down. And so King had that framework, and it wasn't surprising really that he went then beyond civil rights. This is outside of the King Center in Atlanta, and they list the 6 principles of nonviolence. And they go back to Christ and Gandhi. And the idea, of course, is really the same thing that the New Poor People's Campaign is working around now, which is trying to deal with the problems of poor people. And the, as Reverend Barber says, the racial and economic systems that keep people poor. King was especially good at reaching working class people. This was the March to Freedom in Detroit in 1963, before the March on Washington. Heavily union audience. UAW and other unions did a lot of the organizing for the March on Washington. The United Farm Workers, King came into contact with them quite a bit later, but this was also beginning. This is from the campaign in Birmingham, and in 1964, when they succeeded in desegregating the downtown of Birmingham, King was able to get people to learn how to utilize nonviolence even when they were provoked by great violence on the other side. And of course, this led to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and of course, many jailings by King. This is another interesting picture. This happens after King went to Norway to get the Nobel Peace Prize, which followed the Birmingham campaign. As soon as he came back, he was out on the picket line helping to organize and support 800 Black women who were on strike at the Scripto factory in his neighborhood in Atlanta. And so my book traces this, that you can see that these things are all connected all the time. And it was always just a question of what to focus on next. Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the Selma campaign. Of course, you know this picture. This is John Lewis being beaten at the bridge in Selma. Union support all over the country. One thing probably most people don't know is probably this next to the Black church, the Union movement was the strongest support that King had all over the country. And of course, then this led to the Voting Rights Act of '65. And again, King kept going, working with these working class constituencies. And he said that the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65 were just the first phase. It wasn't the end of the movement. It was the beginning of what he called the second phase of the civil rights movement, which was about economic justice. And this, of course, is what led him into the Memphis campaign and the Poor People's Campaign. This was the March Against Fear in Mississippi in 1966, along with Stokely Carmichael there in the front row. Stokely and King had this very interesting relationship that they respected each other a great deal. And Stokely began the Black Power phase of the movement. And King said there's nothing wrong with Black Power, but we also need to link this to economic justice for all people, and still wanted a multiracial movement, and continued on in that direction with the Poor People's Campaign. Stokely said King was at his best when he was out among poor people and people in the streets, that he was in his public role, he was kind of constrained by having to always be eloquent and so forth, but when he was out amongst the people, he was quite a different person. He was a movement person, a builder of movements. Here he is with Joan Baez during that same campaign, and many, many small churches. David Garrow, who wrote one of the first huge books on King, said that he was on the road about 300 days out of the year. He was constantly traveling, constantly speaking, constantly writing, constantly organizing. This is the Detroit uprising of 1967, and this threw things in a different direction. I was from this area. My parents grew up in Detroit, and the social and racial and economic conditions linked with police brutality set off these uprisings all over the country for 4 years, from 1964 through 1968. So this added another level of urgency to King's campaign for social and economic justice. King saw supporting unions as crucial to improving the condition of the Black working class. And I've written some other books about this, about the effectiveness of the CIO unions in the South in creating a Black middle class in places like Memphis and Birmingham and Atlanta and other places. And so his second phase was to try to impact the economic issues He went to Chicago and worked on trying to get open housing and jobs. And of course, then he ended up coming to Memphis in 1968 to support the sanitation workers. And these were people who really were at will. They could be, they had no health insurance, they had no accident insurance. If they were hurt on the job, it was too bad for them. There was no limit to the hours that they worked. They had a bare minimum wage, and but oftentimes worked hours and didn't even get paid for it. So King came to Memphis. One of the things about King was whenever he was called, he would come usually. So let's listen to him for a minute.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave. But I will rise for my right to be free.
If we're going to get equality, if we're going to get adequate wages, we are going to have to struggle for it. You know what? You may have to escalate the struggle a bit. If they keep refusing and they will not recognize the union and will not agree for the checkoff of the collection of dues, I'll tell you what you ought to do, and you're together here enough to do it. In a few days, you ought to get together and just have a general wet stoppage in the city of Memphis.
You know we're standing for our unions and we shall not be moved. You know we're standing for our unions and know that we shall not be moved, just like a tree that's planted by the water. We shall not be moved. And that's why I say there ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. There ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. There ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. You know how walk and talk.
So until I wrote the book, Going Down Jericho Road, usually Memphis was simply seen as the place where King was killed. And people didn't recognize the significance of this mass campaign that happened in Memphis that was in some ways as earth-shattering as the Montgomery bus boycott. King was killed here, but as the workers who I interviewed said, you also have to know that we won our demands, we unionized. King put his life on the line for working class people all the time. He knew he could be killed anywhere. And we have to draw on the legacy of this and understand the power of that movement of joining. It really was the time of joining labor and civil rights. And this is Dr. King with Jerry Werf, President, American Federation of State and County Municipal Employees. That was the union that organized the strike. So ever since April 4th, this was 4 days later after Dr. King died, this tradition started in Memphis of not only recognizing King's birthday of January 15th, but April 4th and the days after that. to constantly return to the legacy of labor and civil rights. And unions all over the country did this then, and they still do it now. They did continue with the Poor People's Campaign, working on welfare rights, workers' rights, abolishing slums and poverty. And as you see here, a year later, these mass demonstrations continued in Memphis. Coretta King went on to work with hospital workers in South Carolina who went on strike, Farm Workers Union. This is with Dolores Huerta of the Farm Workers Union, Cesar Chavez, and of course the Coalition of Labor Union Women. So, you know, we think of the awful period after King's assassination, but we should also remember the fruition of a lot of that organizing that continued into the 1970s. And there's a good book to read called Knocking on Labor's Door, where a historian has connected all the dots of the 1970s, Lane Wyndham. So I'll finish up here. This is sort of brings you into where I came into the story in 1970. Our anti-war demonstrations in Detroit. This is at Oakland University. Going down south, immediately being thrown into jail. This was where I spent 3 weeks in 1970. I was arrested on King's birthday on January 15th for organizing civil liberties protests against the incarceration of people who had protested King's death and then were attacked by the police. We won our case. We won the Black Six case. Also, we went on to work on the Angela Davis campaign, moved down to Memphis, worked around those campaigns of political prisoners. These pictures were taken by Ernest Withers, the great Black photographer who was also working surreptitiously for the FBI and turning these photos over to them, and I have them in my FBI file. Other cases we worked on, police brutality. The Wilmington 10 was one of the great cases of that period, trying to overthrow the apartheid regime in South Africa. Here I am with Lucy Murphy in DC. I went to graduate school at Howard University after 6 years in the movement. And then I started becoming a scholar of all of this history. This is again at the King Center in Atlanta. So I'll finish with this. On April 4th, 2018, 50 years since King was killed in Memphis, we had a mass demonstration. People came from all over the world, but all over the US especially, and particularly union members came to remember King. And Memphis today has most of the same issues it had before. Poverty is about 1/3 of the Black community. Most children are on school lunch programs because they don't have food. And economic justice is far, far away from us in Memphis today. But this struggle goes on, and hopefully we're going to carry it further very soon. We're working on it. And so I stop with that and ask for some questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Honey. Now we'll open the floor to those who want to ask a question or make comment. Let us know you want to ask a question or make a comment by clicking the picture of the raised hand. Click the raised hand icon and we will open your mic so that you can introduce your question or comment. I see one hand so far. Norman, your mic is open.
Okay, thank you, Dee, and thank you, Mike. This is Norman Markowitz. It's great.
I thought that it was, yeah.
It's great to hear you, and this was a wonderful presentation. And my question.
Norman, your we're having trouble hearing you.
How can we really, as teachers, can you hear me better?
How
Yeah.
can we really,
Hello?
how can we really as teachers hear the rest of it?
Yes. How can we as teachers bring the Martin Luther King that we know, the Martin Luther King who was a voice for social justice, freedom, and liberation, as against the Martin Luther King who is seen as the symbol of sort of like Abraham Lincoln. He died to
I
make
think
us free, and it's
yeah.
over. It's over. We honor him. Sinclair Lewis, how can we get that king as against the king who is a symbol of victory in the past and a victory with no social content?
Well, you know, for our scholarship has changed, but the public knowledge of it hasn't changed with it. So the early scholarship on King really framed him as a civil rights leader, but we've had so much research and writing since then that shows this other side and the importance of it. And so I think it's a matter now of trying to get that more and more out to masses of people. And this week coming up, Time Magazine is having a double special issue on King, and they asked me to write a piece on King and economic justice. So even Time Magazine is catching on. The Moody Bible School had me on the radio on a nationwide broadcast to an evangelical audience about the same issue. I think, this is the time to be talking about economic inequality and economic and racial and other kinds of oppression and injustice. And the material's all there. King is incredibly quotable. So if you go back through any of this material, there's lots to draw on. A real short book that's really helpful is called Misremembering Dr. King. That it's a short book that lays out all of these issues that you can use with younger students or pretty much anybody at any level.
Okay. Tonya Taylor, your mic is open.
Hi, it's Tanya Timms Taylor. Thank you. I have a question. I have two questions, actually. The first question is, does your book cover King's time in Chicago? And then secondly, oftentimes when we look at these great, let's say these great Black men, they almost pick up the status of demigods. Oftentimes the role of Black women is missing. And does your book address some of the very supportive and really commanding role that Coretta Scott King, had in their family, economics and also, emotional stability?
Yeah, the book does talk about the Chicago campaign, and it does talk about Coretta Scott King, and the fact that in some ways she was more radical than Martin was, and sooner. And she came from a family in Alabama where people had burned down her father's sawmill because he was making too much money. One of her uncles was lynched. She got to Antioch College based on a scholarship. She was not from a more advantaged family like Martin was. And she was working for Henry Wallace, peace advocate, in 1948. And she really pushed Martin when they first met each other to talk more about the issues of war and peace. And she was really his conscience in a way, not that he needed a conscience, but somebody who said, look, you've got to talk about this, because the pressure on him was to try to, be, quote, the civil rights leader during the early time in his leadership. women were at the core of all of the Black freedom movement struggles in the South. If you look at most of the audience pictures, it's usually majority women. And you had people like Ella Baker and, of course, Coretta Scott King, but many, many other women activists and organizers. And there's a lot of great literature on this. It used to be covered as, you know, the men did everything. But if you look at the literature now, it doesn't look that way anymore. And so there's lots of good material on that. And the thing is that, of course, you still see men in the front row. And Coretta King, for instance, was furious that in the March on Washington, she wasn't allowed to be in the front row with King. He had to link arms with all these Union men. And she didn't even get to meet President Kennedy. So, you know, that period was really bad, and that's why we have the women's liberation movement to break out of all of that. But the labor movement has always, since the CIO anyway, has had women really at the core of a lot of the organizing, and also in the civil rights movement in the South and in the North. Welfare rights was organized by women. And Dolores Huerta was just as important in starting the Farm Workers Union as Cesar Chavez. So yes, there's a huge thing to talk about with women in the movement.
Jose Santiago, open your mic on your end. There you are.
Hi, I'm Jose. I loved your presentation. I was just wondering, what did Martin Luther think on disability equality rights? You know, that is also a factor in this society, because I'm a part of the neurodiversity movement, that I'm not a puzzle, I'm a person movement, and that I'm not a problem, I'm a person movement. What did he think of that relating to class issues?
Yeah, I'm searching my memory. I don't know if that issue was brought forward very strongly anywhere at the time. I'm sure it was somewhere, but it certainly wasn't at the top of his list of things. And I'm sure, you know, a lot of these issues that we think of today, the intersectionality of race, class, gender, and how things are all related, prejudice and oppression to all kinds of people. He would have been there on all those issues. But at the time of his leadership, the first thing on his agenda was, how do we get civil rights before the law for African Americans in the South especially, and then how do we get the right to vote? If we don't have those citizenship rights, we can't do anything. And then moved on to the economic justice campaigns in a way. But, you know, I'm sure he would be tying, if he were alive today, he'd be tying all these issues together. That's really up to us to do now.
John Streeter, open your mic on your end. There you are. Speak up, please. John Streeter, we cannot hear you. Speak up, please. Your mic is open. On our end, your mic is open on your end. Okay, for some reason, we don't hear you. Sorry. James Williams, your mic is open.
Yes. Hi, Mike. This is Jim Williams in Tacoma.
Hey, Jim. Hi.
You know, I was wondering about the times in which Dr. King was growing up in Atlanta. I wonder if there was any thinking by him or his father about things like the Angelo Herndon case. He was arrested in Atlanta for leading an unemployed demonstration. I'm thinking also of the Scottsboro Boys and the first SNCC, the Southern Negro Youth Congress. Now, I know they came along a little later, but I'm wondering if he was aware of some of these things that were happening in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much. He's born in 1929, so Angelo Herndon is what, 1931, I think, and Scottsboro is 34 or something. Who really did know all of these things was Jack Odell, who was a really important aide to King later on after King became a leader. And of course, he knew about all of those things and wrote about it in Freedom Ways magazine. So ultimately, I'm sure King was very aware of those cases that you're bringing up. I don't know as a youngster if he would have known anything about it. And I don't know of his father, Martin Luther King Sr., campaigning around those things. Rosa Parks's husband did campaign around the Scottsboro case, and she worked on a lot of cases before the Montgomery bus boycott. So, I'm sure at various times he learned about all of this, but I don't know as a young person if that was something he learned about. I haven't seen that.
Irving Jones, your mic is open. Irving Jones Webb, your mic is open. Speak up, please. Okay, I'm sorry, we cannot hear you. Moshin, your mic is open.
Thank you, Dennis. Hi, Mike. This is Mohsin Siddiq. At one time, I think we lived near on Adams Morgan area a long time ago. In any way, you talked about the Martin Luther King economic policies of social democracy that he sort of came to on his own. Was there any discussion of reparation within the leadership at that time at all? Do you know?
Say that last part again.
Was there any discussion on the reparation at that time within the leadership?
Yes. King specifically talked about reparations during the Poor People's Campaign down in Mississippi. He went on a couple of speaking tours in early 1968 to try to organize the Poor People's Campaign. And I don't know that he used the word reparations, but he clearly explained that you couldn't put people who'd been under slavery and then segregation and put them at the starting place with other people who hadn't been disadvantaged in that way and expect them to come out the same in a race. And one of the people on the plane told Martin, I think poor people, they should pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And he said, well, that's not a very good thing to say to somebody who has no boots. Essentially, he was calling for reparations through the Poor People's Campaign. And but he also linked that idea to economic equality for everybody, which I think was always his way of linking things together. And so his idea in Poor People's Campaign basically was what we would say today: jobs, housing, healthcare, education. Everybody should have access to all of those things as a human right. And for African Americans who have been historically disadvantaged by slavery and segregation, in order to address those issues, you would have to really make big programs to do it. And of course, that's what he wanted the government to do. And how do you do that? Stop spending all this money on war. And I haven't talked about that too much, but his anti-war position was probably as responsible as anything for him getting killed at that time. And those are the issues now. Why are they spending trillions on these wars and trillions on nuclear weapons instead of putting that money into housing, healthcare, jobs, and education? So yeah, he was totally with that. I just don't think he used the term very much.
At the center here in Chicago, at the Unity Center, there are questions. Please open the mic and let people. Microphone is now open.
Could I speak from here?
First question, yes.
Does your book address the relationship he had with Malcolm X?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I talk about it in the book. You know, Malcolm X derided King a lot for his nonviolence, and felt that really anytime somebody puts their hand on you, you should fight back. And he saw nonviolent direct action in Birmingham and these other places really as kind of unmanly and allowing, sort of leading Black people into an abyss. He felt that people should fight back, and if that meant with arms, do that. And of course, a lot of people felt that way. Robert Williams was doing that in the NAACP in North Carolina. But, you know, King's point was not that you shouldn't defend yourself. He never said that. In fact, he did say specifically that the law recognizes the right of every person to defend themselves. But he said if in a mass movement situation, you have to have discipline and organization. And if you think you're going to win by fighting back, you're kidding yourself. That's a way to sure defeat. So they never really could agree on that, you know. But what did happen was Malcolm X increasingly moved what I would call to the left on economic issues and social issues, and went down to support Dr. King in the Selma campaign when King was in jail. And he came down, Malcolm X came down, and he talked to Coretta Scott King, and he told her, I hope you know we're on the same page. We have some different methods, but the white folks in Alabama should know that if they don't want to deal with Dr. King, then they can deal with Malcolm X, you know, take your choice. And he spoke on behalf of the voting rights campaign. And his attitudes changed a lot, Malcolm X's did. And I think that had they both lived, they would have become strong allies.
Any more questions from the center in Chicago?
Yeah, this is Scott Marshall.
Hey, Scott.
What a trip down memory lane.
Yeah.
Look at all those meetings we sat in.
Yeah.
Anyway, what I really wanted to ask you to expand on, because I'm sure you know a lot of this. I was at a meeting in China years ago, and a labor meeting, and the people were quoting Martin Luther King and his impact internationally on revolutionary movement, on labor, international labor movements and stuff was really incredible. And I wish you would expand on it, because I think not enough people understand his global impact in terms of all these struggles.
Yeah. Well, when I was in Norway a year ago, a lot of people interviewed me from newspapers about Martin Luther King, and he was only there one time in 1964 to get the Nobel Peace Prize, but he had a big impact. And I talked to people from the labor organizations in Norway and Sweden, and he kind of has a central place in their vision of labor and civil rights being part of the same struggle. And I think Malcolm X also had a huge impact internationally. I think with King, one of the really important things is his networking through the labor movement all over the United States. And one of the unions I work with a lot is the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. They see King really as kind of a honorary member of the ILWU. AFSCME sees him as almost a founding member of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, because if they hadn't won that strike in Memphis, they felt that they would have lost a lot of battles in other places. And so, you know, I think he's had a huge impact certainly on human rights, but also on labor rights. And that doesn't, most people don't maybe know that. I mean, you would know it because you've been in labor. And so this is a picture of, I've been trying to sort of tell this story. It's part of what I do. So on the one side here, you see Town Hall, Seattle, and the other you see at a university in Japan. And it was really interesting talking to the Japanese students. Their understanding of King was all about Mr. Civil Rights. But when we talked about it and gave this overview, I think they got a really different idea of it. So, you know, we really just have to keep propagating this connection, intersectionality of labor and civil rights.
We'll take a few more if it's okay. Norma, your mic is open.
Hi, this has been lovely. Thank you, Dee and Michael. I'm Norma Harrison. I'm in Berkeley. I grew up in Chicago. I was there, it used to be for the first half of my life. Now it's a little less than that. And I didn't know. I was so alienated from religious, not alienated, I chose my distance from religious organizing as not being a way to help ourselves. I saw religion as having taken over whatever anybody did and taking it away from them and making them kneel to God and all those people. By the way, I figured out, you ask, there was a question that I thought God was the answer to. Why did that go on? Well, God made it that way.
Right.
But I'm complaining because there was obviously a great deal of activity in Chicago, and somehow I just didn't know about it. I think I was the wrong age. I got married, had a child in 1955, and then had a divorce, and then had to go to school in order to pay the rent, get a job and pay the rent, because I was white and I should go to school to get a degree and get that kind of a job and not the lower paid job. So that I didn't know is much to my chagrin and sorrow. And every time I hear his voice begin in a broadcast, I start crying. It was great.
66 when King was there in 66.
I was there when he came in 63, I think it was. By 66, I went to Israel to help build a socialist-based nation. But
Right.
he came, yeah, I know. He came, my Irish Catholic husband thought it would be a good idea. You know, he was as distant from Catholicism as I was from being Jewish, except how those things influence our inner sides to be nice, you know. But you know, he was there in 63, I thought, and because I know I went up to him at the Packing House Workers Union. He was sitting in the bleachers and it was empty, and he was sitting there contemplative, and I went in and I shook his hand, and I cherished that anyway, even though my distance from religion.
Oh.
Because we were marching, that's what it was. We were marching on Wabash and on Wabash Avenue, and I went in and said that and did that, and I'm glad.
Well, you know, the new Poor People's Campaign is using religion for all it's worth, I think, to try to, I mean, this is one way to try to reach a lot of people in the United States. I was raised as a Unitarian, not, and you know, if you're Unitarian, you're not usually very religious, so to speak. So what appealed to me about King was his moral framework. I never, you know, some of the sermons and things that you can read of King, there's a lot of God talk in there. Well, it doesn't bother me because it's in such a moral framework. And I don't know if the arc of the universe bends toward justice or not, you know, but it's a good idea. And I think that, you're not alone in this. I've talked to people who were in Memphis in 1968 who were young adults, and they didn't even know what was going on during that strike. So, you know, there's always this veil of fog between people in the movement and the rest of the society. So you're lucky if you got to be like what you did, of shaking his hand. That's really great.
Joe, your mic is open. Joe, your mic is open.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Honey. You know, on Atlanta and the King family and the left, if I'm not mistaken, and this may be part of folklore, but I do believe that the family of Benjamin Davis and the King family, I think that they knew each other.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
heard tell that after Martin was stabbed in New York, that Ben Davis donated blood to him, and that some of the right-wing rags in New York City had headlines about King receiving communist blood from Ben Davis.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a little bit of a scandal about that, at least in their minds. My question, though, was the Civil Rights Congress kind of combined.
Tell people who Ben Davis was, because maybe
Ben Davis was a leader of the Communist Party and was elected to the city council in New York City, representing Harlem. And he also defended Angelo Herndon in that case that was referred to above. In fact, Angelo recruited Ben to the party, if I'm not mistaken, as a result of that trial. So he was quite a person. Both of them were. So my question was about the Civil Rights Congress, which kind of combined the struggle for economic and civil rights together. But that struggle in the 50s after the Red Scare assumed more legal forms through the NAACP. And I was wondering just how the civil rights movement responded to King's later combination of economic and civil rights. How did they respond to the Poor People's Campaign? You talked about the labor movement, but I'm just wondering how the civil rights movement and the SCLC and the NAACP responded.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you know, there was a rift between King and the so-called mainstream civil rights organization because of his strong stand against the Vietnam War. So he was heavily criticized for that. And then when he moved into the sort of economic framework of changing the priorities from war to spending money to stop and to end poverty, I think a lot of people looked askance. They didn't think this was going to work. And even in his own staff, he had to argue hard for this. People thought it just would never work and it'd be impractical. But his position was a moral position. This is where we need to go at this time in our history. And it combines the issue of the war and the issue of poverty and the issue of racism, sexism, injustice. So I think a lot of the civil rights, so-called civil rights movement was not following him in this direction. After he was killed, though, a lot of people rallied around the Poor People's Campaign. And of course, you know, that was a terrible time. Then Robert F. Kennedy was killed right in the middle of that. And the rains came and Resurrection City turned into a swamp. It was a very rough time, summer of 1968. One other thing that you mentioned that I'd like to say is King really was a good civil libertarian in the 50s when the Civil Rights Congress was under such attack, and the Southern Conference Educational Fund, Carl and Ann Braden, also under attack. And Ann Braden went down to Mississippi and got arrested with the Civil Rights Congress to try to stop illegal lynching in Mississippi. And of course, the Bradens were constantly red baited, but King stood with Carl Braden and Frank Wilkinson the night before they went to prison in 1961 for refusing to testify before the House On-American Activities Committee. And so that civil liberties issue is always running through there. And it's still the case today, trying to defend our right to speak. And of course, they were trying to shut him up all along. So I think all these issues were connected, but a lot of people were afraid, civil rights movement and others, to really identify. By the time King died, people were afraid to identify with him.
We'll take one more. Anthony Matheson, your mic is open.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Honey, for the presentation. Did Dr. King ever write or speak about how the lie called social Darwinism from the late 1800s impacted class division in the United States?
I don't know. I'm just trying to think about that. I don't know if he called it that, but we know what that is, the idea that if the poor are poor, it's because they're genetically inferior and morally inferior. And if, as Charles Graham Sumner put it, the sociologist, if somebody's in the gutter, what should you do? Well, just kick him and leave him in the gutter. King certainly knew that this was the kind of the merciless framework of American capitalism that would justify the intense poverty of working class people. And so, he read Edward Bellamy's book. One of the early books that he read was a utopian socialist novel. And so that was written in the 1890s, I think, when that social Darwinism was really strong. So I think he obviously knew about it, but he didn't write about it particularly that I can think of. But he did write about the moral issue of injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That he said poverty, someday we'll look back on poverty the way people think about cannibalism, that it should never have happened, was not necessary, never justified. And in the modern world, there's no excuse. And he was thinking internationally too. The awful things that we're seeing happen today, it's really, unfortunately, kind of his fearful vision was that if the U.S. doesn't stop spending all this money on war and means of destruction and siphoning off the wealth to the rich, as he put it, America will be damned. And this will have worldwide reverberations. And we're seeing that now. He said, America, if you don't change, God will rise up and break the backbone of your power. And well, if that's what it takes, that may be what happens. But of course, he wanted to see something much better than that, and the possibility of transformation. So we're at that moment in our history right now. Which way is it going to go? I don't know, but it's up to us to put our shoulders to the wheel.
Okay, the very last question or comment. Yusef, your mic is open. Yusef Gersi, your mic is open. If you're speaking, we cannot hear you.
Oh.
Okay, speak up, please.
Okay, could you please talk a little bit more about King as a peace activist and his Vietnam War speech?
Thank you.
Yeah, that is a fantastic speech. April 4th, 1967, exactly one year to the day before he was killed in Memphis. And in that speech, you really get some of the best formulations about the relationship between violence and poverty, and it's a great scathing critique of American foreign policy. And I think that a lot of times today, fortunately, people are drawing on that speech. When we were marching in Seattle to try to stop Bush's insane intervention in Iraq, I remember thousands of us marching through the streets, and what were they playing? They were playing King's speech against the Vietnam War of 1967. It's a landmark, and I think if people read nothing else about King, that's what they should read, is that speech.
Dr. Honey, if you would like to provide summary remarks, this is the time.
Well, I don't know how to sum it up except, you know, to put it in our context right now. I don't have to really say anything, I'm sure, about the kind of madness that's going on at the top of the government in the United States. But maybe the King framework, if people look at it in its fullness, and he's one of the most quotable people you can ever find. What he talked about really critiques what the Republican Party and Trump are doing today. And maybe, you know, drawing on that history and his example, but his writings and his speeches can help get people to see the moral framework, regardless of whatever religion they are, and even sort of overcoming people's class selfishness to be able to think in the moral framework that King was trying to get across. What he said was that we need a moral revolution. It's not too far from what Bernie Sanders is saying right now. And of course, at the time, I thought, no, we actually need a revolution, just a real revolution, and that's what Malcolm X would say. You know, that a revolution is bloody and so forth. But I think, in retrospect, King had it right. You know, if we could get this moral framework right, then I think a lot of people would have to change their ways. And some of those people, like the president, are totally hopeless. But there are other people who I think can be reached with the Kingian framework, which is, and the idea of nonviolence. You know, that it's not too hard to understand nonviolence if you start studying it. And of course, it goes back to Jesus, among others. So it seems to me that for a long time to come, we study King not because he's a singular hero or because we believe in heroism and great leaders. It's because of the content of what he left behind. And that's why I, you know, work on the King studies, is that I think it helps people to understand and unlock the oppression of the present and see that there is a way out. There is a way out. Thanks everybody for listening in. It's been really great conversation.
On behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank Dr. Honey for joining us tonight. Again, his book, To the Promised Land, Martin Luther King and the Fight for Economic Justice, is well worth your time, well worth the time of your friends and family members and contacts. So please urge everyone to read that book. We'll all be the better for it. And on your behalf, I'd like to extend an invitation to Dr. Honey to come back and provide a presentation on the history of the CIO. When he has time and we can make time, we really enjoy getting together again and hearing his presentation on the history of the CIO, especially in the South.
Yeah,
So
and you might try to get a hold of Robin Kelly also. He'd be a great person to talk about those things too.
Okay. So
Yeah.
thank you and good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us and good night.
Thank you.